So speed is distance over time. And I think about this not directly, but when you're making a video game, you spend a lot of your time thinking about the distances between things, especially like in level design. Everyone builds sort of a level and tries to standardize on like how far you can jump. How big is this? How big is that? But when you're working with the larger scale of things, or when you are working with an open world or a larger area, or just the pacing of an encounter, what ends up happening is you realize the distance or the spacing of things, it still matters, but you're not really counting distance and spacing, you're counting time. Typically, if you're building an open world, it's more important to figure out how long it takes to get from point A to point B. I typically think of that as how long it takes to get across the map, as opposed to like the actual distance that should be. So, one of the sort of things I've found is that if the player is spending more than about 30 seconds to a minute to get from one side to the other, they're starting to get in that sort of long sort of time period. Like 90 seconds, I would say. That is going to start to feel like a long time, but it's not actually going to like be a long time. And when you look at games that have very realistic scales of distances, they always feel very off or very strange. I think one of the other important aspects of this is that while it does take longer to go from point A to point B and get across the whole map, you also have to think about how long it takes to move in a smaller location. And in a smaller location, your distances might actually be slightly larger because you made the player move faster to feel responsive or to let them dodge projectiles, stuff like that. So their concept of like how wide a hallway should be might not be anywhere close to realistic, but it might be realistic from the perspective of someone actually trying to move and react. I kind of really noticed this with some work I did on an old Deus Ex sort of level. So for that game, it ships with an editor, and so I built a map. But I sort of did like a kind of open world style sort of thing where there's like kind of one big hub map, and then players can walk around. And the nice thing about that is I was able to get in pretty early and determine like, okay, how long should it take for me to just make this walking distance, and I kept it pretty close to like around 30 seconds or so, and that really does give you a lot of space to work with. And you start thinking about how we pace, sort of like how often the player should encounter something, to make a space, not feel crowded, but also feel like used. And it generally kind of comes down to around, I've heard some developers say like every 7 seconds or so there should be something, the player should be able to encounter something interesting. I think that can go as long as, 10 seconds or as low as 5, but I think somewhere within there, I think they're talking about the right amount of density. And once I sort of really discovered this sort of concept, it kind of made me like a little bit obsessed with it. I always started thinking about like, well, how long does it take to go from here to here? How long does, what's the perception of time like between different things? I think this sort of perception of time, sort of the difference between it and realism and video games, kind of comes back again to this sort of like the abstract nature of a video game. It's not an entirely realistic representation, even though we try to make it look real. The situation is we can't design it to be real because it's never going to feel the same as actually like walking down a hallway where like I don't know what happens, but if you've ever thought about walking down a hallway, the attention you have and the thoughts you have and like what's going on in your head, that entire experience, it's almost like just like a blank in time. It's almost like you're sort of just appearing at the other end or like appearing at the doorway you want to be at. You don't have this like you don't like sit down and really focus in your head as to what's going on as you're going about some of the more mundane traveling that happens in your life. It's sort of strange because the idea that like your brain is sort of shutting out these things kind of comes back to like how like a movie is like reality with all the boring bits cut out. When you get down to the sort of aspect of a video game, it has kind of a similar sort of vibe or similar sort of idea where it's reality, but we're cutting out all the bits you don't perceive because the like level of attention you have to a video game is like so much more heightened. And suddenly those hallways that you walk down like every day and it takes you like 3 minutes or something to like get from your bus stop to your apartment, suddenly that becomes like an insane amount of time to actually just play in a video game. So in a video game, right, you shorten all those distances. So all of that stimulation that would normally happen is just happens in that condensed amount of time because you have such a focus going on. That whole recognition of not spending your time trying to figure out how long something should be in distance, but how long it should be in time, is probably what relates to the feel of games so much more. Like there's a reason why we have a statistic for time to kill and hits to kill. Sometimes that time to kill is what really makes a game feel the way it does. Like a great example of this would be like if you look at the games that have a really short time to kill and the games that have a really long time to kill. The difference is not as big as you would think. It's maybe like the shortest games are about half the length of the longest games. When you start to realize that there is this sort of difference, you can start to see that it's really this timing that contributes and creates the feel of a video game. I don't really see a lot of people talking about that as opposed to sort of other sort of disciplines when it comes to how an actual game feels. So I guess paying attention to the times of things is kind of like that secret skill that everyone should kind of get a hold of a little bit. And if you just enjoy video games, maybe pull out a stopwatch and see how long it takes to run across your favorite map. Oh, and one more thing. If you play like Breath of the Wild or like the newer Zelda games, figure out how long it takes to run like on foot across places, or how long it takes to travel by horse, or how long it takes to travel, doing some other crazy scheme you figured out. I think you'll find too that 30-second sort of interval of what seems like a long distance still hold up, but only in certain circumstances. Like you may find like, oh, the towns are spaced out, maybe like 30 to 90 seconds apart, whereas like if you were to just try to run somewhere, it's gonna feel like way longer than it should. And I think that's kind of in a way sort of the way their game tells you, like, not to run so long and get a horse and stuff like that. Unless of course, and I think Breath of the Wild is a great example of this, because you have the plateau where there are no horses, so you can kind of have some fun with that and be like, oh, okay, what's the timing feel like in the plateau, and then what's the timing feel like everywhere else. So I think I've probably given you a little too much on that. I don't want this one to get too long, so I'm going to end it here.